Ah. Sorry, it was just an awkward moment with when I switched the lighting and then like the bright light came to my face. Anyway, just before we start, we're just going to put all my notifications on social media. So just give me a minute here. A couple minutes actually, but you get what I mean. You get what you know what I mean. Okay, let's get that. It's kind of chilly in here. One thing that sucks about living in Canada. It's always cold. I mean, you gotta take the good with the bad, though, right? Like something that I'm always eternally grateful, especially living on the West Coast. Never complain about it. Is at least we don't have to deal with like giant bugs and like overgrown spiders, because like I would see like pictures of like this buddy of mine. He'll post pictures of like these giant spiders he sees, and he lives in Australia. I think he lives in just off Memphis or something like that. Not Tennessee, the one in Australia, obviously. And he would post these pictures of these giant spiders and like these long millipedes and stuff like that. And it just makes my skin crawl every time I see him. Like, you know, I am eternally grateful that I don't live there. Because I would cry, honestly. I would just like go in fetal position and cry. Just want to check something. Give me a minute. Okay, whatever. I thought that I could see something, but whatever. Okay. Got the social media stuff out of the way. With that done, I'm gonna put this away so my face is not as glowing. Cause like, of course, part of it is like my screen, and especially when you have a white screen, you know, like your Google Chrome page or whatever, and like the light just like blares at you, and it's like, it just makes it look really funny on the camera, at least from what I can see on the OBS thing. So, anyway, enough delay, right? It's 3:05. Let us get started. Hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads the Book of Exodus. I said that this is what I was going to do when I finished Genesis. And I was just like, hey, you know, just going to keep reading along and just read Exodus next. I was actually thinking about changing what I was going to read based on, you know, some stuff that's been happening in the political world, and I think there would have been another book that would have been really good to read, but I might save that actually for a video series, like an upload series that I might do after I finish Shadow Dragon, because I'm actually pretty close to finishing Shadow Dragon. So maybe when I do that, and then I'll just do uploads of like reading another book in the Bible and talking about like those kind of things. But for the stream, we're gonna do Exodus, as I said we would. And so today we'll be starting in chapter 1. Just a quick recap of what had happened in Genesis and how it leads up into Exodus. So basically, I don't know why I have this on. I was like, why do I need this on? I don't need this on right now. what happened in Genesis, at least the end of Genesis, was that the Hebrew people, well, they weren't a people yet, it was literally like one guy and his extended family, basically move into Egypt, and they settle in the land of Goshen, which is like near the delta of the Nile in North Egypt. And so basically Jacob and his family all moved there because of course Joseph was living in Egypt. He became like second in command, and so Joseph had his family move in, and they had been living there. And basically the last thing Jacob is basically told is, well, your family's going to be here for a long time, and you'll become a multitude of people, blah, 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 blah. And then I will bring your people out of Egypt one day. And that's kind of how Genesis ends. Of course, Jacob dies, and then Joseph then dies as well. Now, the book of Exodus will actually make a major time jump of about 400 years, which is where we start. Before we start actually reading, I will just tell you I am using the New International Version. If you guys want to follow along, just get a Bible Gateway or use the Bible app. There's no reason not to use the free Bibles online, okay? Like, there's no reason not to. So I just have a paper copy just because, I don't know, it just I don't know, feels right. But no other reason. Like, there is no reason not to use like an online copy, right? I'm not one of those people that would say like, oh, you have to have like a paper copy. Like, you don't have to. Like, the beauties of the internet is that we can have the Bible right in front of us at any time. And there's no reason not to. So, if you want to follow along, I'm using the New International Version. But before we actually start reading, I'm just going to start us off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Lord God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for 2021. We thank you for this opportunity we have now to read into your word. And I pray that as we read your word, you would bless us as we seek you. I pray this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. Alrighty, so here we go. First Bible reading stream of 2021. Exodus, chapter 1. So these are the names of the son of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali, or Naphtali, I don't know why I keep saying Naphtali. Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all, and Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new Pharaoh, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." My microphone a little bit. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and spread out. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites, and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar, and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. Now the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, I think that's how you pronounce that: When you are helping the Hebrew women, during childbirth on the delivery stool. If you see the baby is a boy, kill them. Sorry, I just gotta check this. No. I thought it was my sister. My sister was gonna call me for something, so I have to just keep my ears peeled for that. But it wasn't my sister, so don't worry about that. I'm gonna do that voice again. When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the Pharaoh of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every Hebrew boy that is born to you must be thrown into the Nile, but let every girl live." So chapter 1 kind of sets the scene, right? So a huge amount of time has passed. Joseph's name has been forgotten among the annals of Egypt. And now we have a pharaoh who's kind of a major dick. He's just straight up like, no, we got to oppress these people and we got to make sure they don't have boys, right? Because we need to kind of destroy their culture as well as destroy their spirits. And so, I mean, there's some odd implications of like just keeping the girls around, because girls can be used for other things. But the Egyptian pharaoh wanted to kill off all the men because he wanted to make sure Israel could not, establish a force and become, and basically cause an uprising. Is basically what was going on here. Of course, something that's kind of funny is that, you have these midwives, and I assume, I don't know why there's only 2 of them. You would think that, I don't know, if the Egyptians are worried about the Israelites growing like to such large numbers, and it's pretty clear that they have, and yet there's only the 2 of them. Maybe there were other ones. The Bible just doesn't tell us, but there's not a lot of these midwives, and Pharaoh wasn't very good at giving his instruction, right? He's just like, oh yeah, just kill the boys, which is kind of like stupid, right? It's like, I mean, obviously the Pharaoh wants to make sure the Israelites don't grow powerful. But I know there is something troubling in this chapter, and I know what, if you haven't thought of it yet, I might as well ask it for you. So basically people say, well, wait a minute, why would God bless these 2 women if they lied? Because that's what they did to Pharaoh. They lied to him. Of course, if you read in the 10 Commandments, one of the commandments is do not lie. And the reason why lying is viewed as such an awful thing, and I'll come back to this when we get to the 10 Commandments, which is later in Exodus. The reason why lying is something that you cannot say is because it is antithetical to the nature of God, right? Because, God is God is truth. And so if God is truth, then therefore, he is obviously against the contempt of truth, right? So that is why God is against truth. But of course, even within the 10 Commandments, there is a tier of which commandments are more important than other ones. It's just the way, it's kind of obvious, right? And so there's a reason why lying is also pretty low on the list, because there are certain things that override it. Of course, if lying is number 9, I'm going to point us to commandment number 6, which is do not murder. And this is where perhaps this is one of the exceptions to lying, right? Because I know a lot of people, they try to act smart, and think they can stump Christians when they say well, what about the people who lied to the Nazis, right? Or something like that. Oh, see, wouldn't if you really wanted to be consistent with your belief in God, then you should have told the Nazis the truth and let them kill Jews. But once again, the Bible is also pretty clear on if you assist someone who commits murder, you can be charged with the same crime, right? And that would be worse on someone's conscience, right? So yes, there is actual, to answer the question that you might not have asked, but I'll ask it for you, are there exceptions to lying? And the answer is actually yes. And the only exception is in regard to saving human life, which is what happens here in Exodus chapter 1, right? The midwives save the Hebrew boys, right? Because, they're human beings. You should save human lives, right? And so lying is justified in this case only with because it's the only real exception that the Bible has, right? Which is saving human life. Because once again, that's something Jesus prioritizes, right? I mean, what is more important to do on the Sabbath? To save life or to kill it? And so, because of course Jesus asks it rhetorically, because the laws in the first century was all about oh, well, in the Sabbath we don't do any work. But Jesus says, well, you can obviously make an exception to the Sabbath, right? In regards to working, right? You can make exceptions, and that's to save human life, because of course, God prioritizes saving human life. And so I just wanted to cover this because I know some people, when they read Exodus 1, they get a little bothered by oh, these women lied, and then God blesses them, right? So God blessed these women for committing a sin, basically. But once again, yes, it's true that all sin is wrong, but at the same time, not all sins are equally wrong, right? Because it would have been way worse for these women to obey Pharaoh and kill the Hebrew boys. That would have been way worse, right? So I just wanted to clear that up in case some people have that little confusion about Exodus 1 and why God was okay with the midwives lying. But that's because this is the exception, and that is to save human life. And, going back to when some people try to stump Christians by saying, well, what about when the Nazis came and there were a lot of Christians that lied to the Nazis? Well, of course you lied to the Nazis, right? You lie. Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, right? And so, yeah, sure, lying is a sin, but when an evil man comes to your door and wants to kill somebody, you don't tell them the truth, because that makes you an accomplice to evil, right? To the act of murder. And that's worse. That's way worse than lying, right? Not to say that lying is fine in other cases. Of course it's not, right? We should always try and be truthful. But there are exceptions to the rule. And the Bible acknowledges this, is what I'm getting at. So I'm not saying that there are exceptions to the rule. The Bible clearly says, yes, there are things more important. And I mentioned this when I was talking about Joseph's story, right? Where Joseph, not in regards to lying, but when it comes to what is more important, sometimes other things that we may view as wrong are not that much of a big deal. They're not that much of a deal because there are things more important, right? And so when Joseph became second in command in Egypt back in Genesis, he adopts a pagan name and lives in essentially a pagan life. He becomes Zephanath Paneah, the one who hears the gods. Ironic for a guy who's monotheistic, right? And of course he marries the daughter of a priest of another religion, right? But Joseph, he kind of doesn't care, because there are things more important than those being overly strict on things like that, right? Like the kind of woman he marries or whatever, right? There are things more important, and that is saving people's lives. I mean, and that's how Joseph pulls off saving, basically the entirety of Egypt, right? And in the same way here in in Exodus 1, we see that, right? What's more important? Saving life or, less important rules? Of course, all God's rules are important, but there is a hierarchy within God's rules. And so valuing human life is near the top of God's rules. And with that being said, other things you can compromise on them sometimes if you're doing it to protect human life. And so in the case of killing baby boys, right? That's really messed up, right? And so yeah, these midwives were not going to participate in such an evil act. And so even if even if God were to condemn them for lying, I mean, I would rather be condemned for being a liar than being condemned because I was a child murderer. So, I mean, you gotta take your pick here, right? It's kind of like think of it realistically, right? Like, even if these women didn't fear God, right? Even though the Bible tells us they did, right? You gotta think that logically. Like, what would I rather be guilty of? Would I rather be guilty of lying, which is a bad thing in itself, or would I want to be guilty of slaughtering people's babies, which is like way worse, right? Because that's like ensuring everybody hates you, right? And on top of that, you know, these are Hebrew midwives, right? Like, imagine how messed up to like kill your own kind, basically, right? Slaughtering like your own people's kids, right? Like, that's so messed up. You know, I'd rather be called a liar than the killer of my peers' children, right? I'd rather be a liar. But, you know, clearly lying is not as high on the importance list, even though it's pretty important, right? Because lying is antithetical to the nature of God. But you know what else is also antithetical to the nature of God? Killing babies. So, and, you know, the killing babies one must be a bigger deal if the midwives were willing to compromise that, like, well, God is truth, but I'm going to tell a lie anyway, right? I'd rather be a liar than be a child murderer. And that, you know, when you say that out loud, it makes sense, right? And so, when you read Exodus 1, and it's not a strange thing for these women to lie and for God to be okay with it. Because there are worse things to do in life than to lie. So I hope that gets that question out of the way. Alright. Chapter 2. Now there was a man of the tribe of Levi, and he married a Levite woman. And she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. That must be quite the feat. I mean, considering that babies cry all the time. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds, along the bank of the Nile. Now the baby's sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, as you do, and her attendants were walking along the river bank. I mean, I thought the whole reason of throwing children into the Nile was so that, well, I mean, I guess they could just drown. But that then begs the question, why would a princess of Egypt be bathing in a place where you drown babies? Just think about that. That's messed up. Sorry, I got sidetracked there. Anyway, the princess saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then the baby's sister, who I guess, happened to be there, asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Clever. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." Nice. And so the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. The princess named him Moses, saying, "I drew him from the water." Now one day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his people were, and watched them at their hard labor. Now he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that, and seeing nobody, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. And he asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" And the man said, "But who made you ruler to judge over us? Are you thinking about killing me like you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flocks. Now some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, Reuel is not an easy name to pronounce. I think it's actually pronounced Ruel. If you know the correct pronunciation, you can correct me on it. But we're going to call him Reuel. Their father. He asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" And the daughters answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "And where is he? Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." So Moses agreed to stay with the man, who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Now Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. Now God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. So chapter 2 has like 2 little stories that happens in it, right? So the first one is the birth of Moses and his baby life, basically, where after a few months they had to kind of send him away. Although I know it's easy to kind of criticize Moses' mom about how like sending a basket down the Nile would not be a very effective, means to save the baby. At least realistically, right? I mean, obviously this is a miracle that Moses survives. But, you put a baby in a basket down, a river, right? The river's going to push this basket to who knows where. And then what's the baby going to do after that, right? Like, assuming nothing eats him along the way. Because, like, the Nile has all these crocodiles and crap in it, right? And other dangerous sea life. Or river life, technically. Besides the point. You don't expect this baby to get very far, right? But, to be fair, the only justification would be, it would be better that she didn't see a crocodile eat her son than to have an Egyptian come into the house and stab the baby, because that'd be worse, right? Because there's always, it could be worse. And nobody ever wants the, it could be worse scenario to happen, right? So, there's that sense of mercy there, I guess. But, God had other plans, clearly, where not only does he save the baby from getting torn to shreds by a crocodile or something like that, but, of course, he stumbles upon the princess of Egypt. And the princess of Egypt being, a typical young girl, typical young woman, she's, like, moved by compassion, and the maternal instincts come in, right? And so it's funny because, like, she knows it's a Hebrew baby. And I'm pretty sure she's aware of her father's law. And the princess is just like, no, I want to keep this kid. I'm going to raise him like he's my own, right? And so it's just kind of funny. I mean, of course, it's like, once again, it's like a miracle from God that this is how God saves Moses. And of course, I think there's also an ironic kind of play here. Where Egypt's downfall is its own fault more than anything, right? It's ironic, right? Because, you know, we read it back in chapter 1, and the Pharaoh was all like, kill every last one of them, right? And it is, you know, a guy as mustache-twirlingly evil as the Pharaoh of Egypt is here. You know, you think, like, someone's going to have retribution on this guy, right? But really, the downfall that will happen to Egypt later on in the story, it's really Egypt's own doing, right? It is their own fault more than it is like the fear of the Israelites uprising, right? I mean, all he had to do was just leave them alone, right? But of course, yeah, there was the whole like, well, his fear is legitimate that if the Israelites became too numerous and if Egypt had to go to war, Israel could backstab them. But I mean, sure, that's a legitimate fear, but there's better ways of going about it than what the Pharaoh did. And so with the princess saving Moses, it's meant to be this ironic moment, you know, that your downfall is going to come and this is your own fault, right? You have nobody to blame but yourself. And so it's kind of like, I think the story kind of plays this irony, but of course you have to look at it the larger story as a whole. I'm just kind of telling you this now to keep this in mind as I keep reading, because you'll see this kind of be the thing, right? And of course, this Pharaoh, he dies, and then there's a new Pharaoh after who Moses goes up against. And of course, if you ever watch, like, you know, the Prince of Egypt movie, which I think is a great movie, or like the Ten Commandments movie, that older one, or any of those, like, you know, the Exodus story, it does have like several movie adaptations, and to be fair, it is one of the more interesting stories to make a movie out of, right? And so you kind of see, you know, there's another dynamic that the story doesn't tell, at least the Bible doesn't tell us, and a lot of, like, this is like people's imagining when they made the movie adaptations, where, like, since Moses was raised in Pharaoh's house, there could have been some connection between, like, Moses and the next Pharaoh, right? But I think one of the interesting dynamics, at least I'm just thinking about this, and you kind of have to see the movie yourself, but there is an interesting dynamic with, like, the princess and how she's like his mother later when Moses grows up, and there's like this whole thing when Moses is kind of troubled by like who he is, right? Is he a Hebrew or is he an Egyptian? And of course, like the princess, who's his, like, you know, his mom, right? She's all like, no, you're my son, kind of thing, right? And whatever, no, things like that don't matter. But in the end, you know, God had other plans, and so Moses is the person to be chosen. I mean, that's why the story even talks about him this way, right? Moses is the one that's chosen, right? And of course, like, you know, every pastor who's done sermons on Moses, you know, always like talk about how he's this like Christ figure at the time, right? And he will be the savior of Israel. So he has a very interesting beginning, right? He should be dead. He is raised in the house of his people's enemies, and then he will later become the liberator of his people, right? And so Moses has a very interesting origin. So that's kind of the first bit of the story that's told in chapter 2. Then we jump, like, basically we make this major time jump of Moses being an adult, and he leaves Egypt because he kills somebody, right? And this is one of those funny things where, like, the interesting beginnings of this guy who's supposed to later be the savior of Israel during the Exodus, right? He has a very interesting beginning. So he's a baby that should be dead. He's raised in the house of the enemy of his people. And now he goes and he basically commits murder, right? He kills this guy. This Egyptian guy who, not a nice guy, but, even if the Egyptian slave driver is not a nice guy, you don't just straight up go up and kill the guy, right? You don't just straight up murder this guy, right? Even an Egyptian slave owner, you don't just murder these people, right? Like, yeah, they're not good guys, but that doesn't mean you just go up and knife them, okay, right? And then you bury them in the sand, right? The ultimate disrespect, right? So Moses, not a great guy himself, right? So it's kind of one of those things where, and I've talked about this so many times in Genesis, and I'll say this over and over again, because it's kind of it's a consistent theme in the Bible. But once again, when we talk about, like, when God uses people, right, to do his great works or whatever, once again, you have to remember that this is about who God is, right? That God is going to save Israel. And not so much Moses. I mean, Moses is the instrument that God saves Israel. But it's more about who God is and what God does, not Moses. Because clearly, Moses ain't that much better than, the Egyptians, right? He's a pretty awful guy himself. So it makes you wonder, right? Like, why would God use pretty awful people to do his work? But it's not so much about who they are, right? It's not about who Moses is. Even though if you asked a Jew in the first century, if you ask most Jews, even to this day, who the greatest Jew was, they would probably tell you Moses, right? But you read here, Moses, who he was in the past, not a very good guy, right? Even if you want to try and help your people, right? Murder should not be your first resort. Which is also another thing to think about, how there's this ironic twist, right? Where, back in chapter 1, these women, they're like, oh no, we're not going to no way we're committing murder, right? And here's Moses just like NBD, right? And then, of course, God is still going to use him, because once again, it's about who God is, right? And not who Moses is and how great he is. But this is about, God is just still finding an opportunity to use Moses, right? Despite the fact that Moses, he's an enemy of his own people, and he apparently is not he's a killer. Not somebody you expect to be the instrument of deliverance for a people group. But let's keep reading. Chapter 3. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And yes, it's kind of hilarious that this guy has two names, but perhaps the Hebrew writers knew that the Ruel name doesn't roll off the tongue easily. So Jethro is what we're calling him now. So Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And Moses led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb. Or Oreb. I think the H is actually silenced. To Oreb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Now Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over there and see this strange sight. Why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face, because he was afraid to look at God. for good reason. And the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the ways the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses retorted to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is the name you shall call me, from generation to generation. So go, assemble the elders of Israel, and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you, and I have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised to bring you out of your misery in Egypt, and into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor, and any woman living in her house, for articles of silver and gold, and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and your daughters. And so you will plunder the Egyptians. Alright, so chapter 3. One of the most famous scenes in the Bible. At least the first half of it, because chapter 4 has the other half of it. So Moses encounters the burning bush. And so this scene is, like one of the most interesting scenes. And I mean, for so many reasons, right? I mean, I could almost make an entire stream on this chapter alone. But we're not going to do that. But there's a lot that happens in chapter 3, right? So Moses encounters, God in this burning bush. And there's that interesting language, right, of the angel of the Lord. And I talked about this in Genesis, throughout the Genesis series, about how, most Bible scholars, well, Christian Bible scholars, acknowledge that this would have been the person of Jesus Christ, right? And so it's interesting that this is who he's talking to, and this is where a lot of people, there's that old myth that a lot of people I pointed this out in Genesis as well. So it's important to, if you're not up to speed, you might want to rewatch some of those videos, even though yes, they are kind of long, but they are up. I have them up on YouTube, so it's one reason why I switched to YouTube in the first place, so that if you need to look back on my older streams, you can. But anyway, there's that weird, myth that a lot of people, even Christians, kind of tell this idea that like the God of the Old Testament is different from, the God of the New Testament in Jesus. But in actuality, this couldn't be further from the truth, because more often than not, these people like, Moses here, as well as like Abraham and so on, when they encounter this angel of the Lord figure, right? Which is in one way, in the Hebrew interpretation, is a euphemism for God, right? Because you don't outright say the name of God, right? In Jewish tradition, it would be blasphemous to say it. But anyway, so the angel of the Lord is used as a euphemism. So either way you look at it, this is God Moses is talking to, right? And so in the Christian worldview, because the title of the angel of the Lord is a manifestation of the person of God. And so the New Testament writers also acknowledge that like Jesus is the only real manifestation of God, which is kind of a weird thing to think of, right? But of course, the other thing that we can easily assume is that since he's God and all that, he can take on any form. So when he takes these different forms, it's always the same guy, but he can take all these different forms because he's God. He can do that, right? So, I mean, it'd be weird if he wouldn't be God if he couldn't do that, right? Because then he wouldn't be omnipotent, right? So, anyway, the same figure here, and the interesting thing, the reason why I point this out, is one, kind of to debunk that whole misconception that like the God of the Old Testament is different than God of the New Testament, because God here says some pretty mean things, right? He's gonna be like, yeah, not only will I kick the Egyptians' asses really badly, but you're also gonna take a lot of their stuff when you leave, right? Which makes you go, huh, right? God actually allows these people to like pillage the Egyptians after like the biggest butt kicking they're gonna get. Well, apparently, Jesus is cool with it, right? Because once again, he also wants to provide for the Israelites, because what would be the point of sending them out to the desert and then let them die there, right? Which is something the Israelites will complain about a lot later, but we'll get there. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. And of course the Egyptians will recover, right? So it's not like he's telling them to kill the Egyptians and leave the place barren, right? The Egyptians will recover. And so, God will show that bit of mercy, but we don't read about it. But anyway, besides the point. So there's a lot of things that goes on in this scene. So Moses encounters God in this scene, and there's always that one part that's supposedly like the most mind-blowing moment, and it's more than mind-blowing, really, because it's one of those funny things where like one of the biggest limitations of not just language. So there's a limitation of language. Then there's the limitation of the fact that the Bible is mostly text, right? And then the limitation of culture, right? And the way that cultures can perceive things. So you have like a triple whammy of like dealing with different limitations that really, this scene is way more profound than people think it is. And I mean, that's not necessarily true. I think the problem is because it's so ridiculously profound. Like, where do you even start, basically, right? And that, of course, is the name of God, right? So Moses asks God, like, yo, when I go to the people of Israel, what do I tell? Like, they're going to ask me who sent me. Like, who are you? what do I tell them? What is your name? And you see this a lot in like science fiction and fantasy movies and literature. They kind of play on this, and this is idea of like, how can you begin to comprehend what I am? Right? And that's what the name I am actually means. I think that's something a lot of people misinterpret. But it's really God saying, how can you even begin to comprehend what I am? Right? And that's why he says, I am who I am. Right? Because you have to look at the wording carefully. And this is where grammar is very important. Right? Because remember, Moses asks God, what is your name? Who do I tell the Israelites, who sent me? Let me read it for you. Okay, so Moses says in verse 13, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? And so there's something interesting going on here when Moses brings up this clear objection of, okay, well, what is your name? Right? What do I tell the people your name is? And this is interesting because there's this, if you can remember all the way back in Genesis, 2, basically, and Adam's primary function and the function and the identity of human beings is about names, right? Humans label everything, right? That's kind of the whole thing about being human, right? We label everything. Everything's got to have a name. Everything's got to have its name and place, right? And so the way I said that kind of gives it away, right? When we name something, we give it its identity, and in a way, that is that thing's place, right? So it's interesting that Moses words the question this way, right? Like, what is your name? And so, in a way, Moses is guilty. Well, not him directly, but him and every other person basically. And to this day, we still do this. And God kind of like, on the one hand, it's like, you can't really do this to me, but on the other hand, well, you're humans and you can't help yourselves. So I'm just going to let it slide, right? And so God doesn't give him a name, right? Well, he gives him one later. And he once again kind of gives his like rhetorical name, right? He's just the God of your ancestors. He doesn't really give them a name. And it's one of those things where like, even though, Yahweh is like a name that should not be uttered by Jews because it's such a holy name, even that is not a name, right? It is merely a way that we identify who God is. And that's kind of like, you read through the Bible and God has so many names, right? And that's because we as people try to identify different parts of who God is, right? Like El Shaddai, Adonai, right? And all those other El names, right? And it's all these kind of like, we try to piece together, who God is. But how do you even begin, right? And so this statement of the I am statement is kind of meant to reinforce that. It was like, well, I am. There's nothing, how can you begin to comprehend what I am, right? I simply am. And, you think of like a lot of science fiction movies, and I kind of mentioned this earlier. They like using this, right, to kind of have this being that is beyond human comprehension, and they're like, wow, I simply am, right? And when in those moments, what you're supposed to understand in those scenes, in those movies, is that like, well, this is a being that is far beyond human comprehension, right? You're not supposed to understand what they are, right? A clear example of this that in modern memory is relatively modern memories. Like the movie's quite a few years old now, so we have to think how fast time travels. But in Avengers 2: Age of Ultron, where Vision is born, and he wakes up, and I can't remember who it is. I think Captain America asks, "Who are you?" And Vision just goes, "I am." And so this idea is that he is beyond human comprehension. He doesn't have a name because he's more than what humans can think of, right? And so this idea of being so much more than what human comprehension and really by extension this plane of existence. That's kind of the idea that's being played at. And so when God calls himself this, that's kind of what's being suggested, is that God is saying, well, I do not fit in, how you think you can understand things. I don't have a name. I do not have a label. I do not have a place in the way that we humans like to label and place things, right? Which is essentially what philosophy is all about, right? You think of, every form of philosophy is all about putting reality in its place, right? And everything's got to fit nicely in its place, or else we have disorder, we have chaos, right? And so when God refuses, in a sense, to fit within those labels, right? He is, because he's God, he exists beyond all that, is kind of what he's getting at. But it's one of those things that, like, this is why this chapter can be troubling for a lot of people too, where it's like, well, God never really gave him an answer, and then the answer he gives him a few verses later, it's not really an answer, right? Because God says the same thing. He's like, well, the way you identify me is the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob, right? Of course, Jesus clarifies what this actually means later. And to give a spoiler, I'm going to find that passage for you, actually, just to make sure I don't screw it up. But it's in, I can't remember. It's in the book of John. I know that much. But the name that God later gives Moses in this scene, okay, it's going to take a while for me to find it. I know the context to it, too. So, John, death of Lazarus, not too far. Nope. Let me just, I'm sorry, I gotta find something here. Okay, it may not be the book of John. I thought it was in the book of John. It's a book of, maybe a book of Matthew? Might be another Matthew passage. Sorry, I should have looked this up earlier. But there's an interesting passage to read in context of what God's actual statement means in Exodus 3. And you need to look at when Jesus kind of re-says this line, and then he clarifies what this line means. If I can find the dang thing. Grace of the kingdom. Oh, here it is. Okay, so I found it. Okay. So if you want to... Okay, I'm going to read the Exodus passage, and then I'm going to read the Matthew passage, which clarifies what this statement actually means. So, God says to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. So what happens here is that at first God says, oh, I don't have a real answer to your question because I am beyond things like names, which is a simple way of wording it, right? I am beyond your concept of names and labels because, he's God and all that, right? So he's saying, like, well, I'm beyond such things. But tell them that the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob has sent you. Which is funny because Moses already said, earlier, or sorry, not Moses. God said earlier, no, it is Moses says it. So Moses says, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. So, in a way, the Israelites already have an understanding of who God is, right? He's the God of Abraham, right? And that's kind of the euphemism implied when Moses says, the God of your fathers, right? So they would have been like, well, of Jacob and of Isaac and of Abraham, our patriarch, right? And then when God retells Moses, tell them, if you have to give me a name. And that's one of the interesting grammar things you have to see here, right? So after God says, I am has sent me to you, then the next sentence is, God also said to Moses. So the implication here is that maybe God thought about it for a while or something. I mean, the Bible's not clear on it. Basically, there's a little bit of a pause. And then God gives him this answer, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent you, right? And so Jesus actually clarifies his statement, because I guess most of us were too stupid at the time if we just read Exodus in a vacuum, we're too stupid to figure this out. So Jesus then tells what this statement actually means when he's debunking the Sadducees in Matthew 22. In Matthew 22, starting from verse 23, there is a scene where there's a bunch of Sadducees, and basically what a Sadducee was a person who understood the Old Testament text, but they did not believe in things like the resurrection. They didn't believe in the spiritual. They kind of treated the Bible, the Torah, as like more history and just law, as opposed to like, the more magical elements of the miracles of God. They didn't believe in stuff like the afterlife. And so the Sadducees want to try and trick Jesus. And so the story goes like this. The same day the Sadducees, who say there's no resurrection, came to Jesus with a question. And they said, Teacher, Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up an offspring for him. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first one married and died, and since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. The same thing happened to the second, and then the third, all the way down to the 7th. Working through the family, lady. Finally, the woman died. Now then, at the resurrection, because now they're trying to trap Jesus, saying, well, let's say the resurrection is a thing. Whose wife would she be, since she was married to all 7 of them? And then Jesus replies, You are in error because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God. At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven, implying that they will be immortal and magical and all that other awesome stuff. They will be like the angels in heaven. But about the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what God has said to you? And this is why Jesus makes his first snarky remark of, have you not read the scriptures? Right? Back in 29, Jesus says, you're in error because you do not know the scriptures. So he says again later, but about the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what God said to you? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. And I mean, every so right they would be astonished, because, I mean, he clarifies this really ambiguous statement back in Exodus 3. And so when he says, this is my name forever. Oh, sorry, I'm going back to Exodus, and this is verse 14. Oh, sorry, verse 15. So God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name, at least the name you will use, forever. The name you shall call me from generation to generation. And so what he's really saying here is that wherever there is something, because, when we have something, we have essentially the foundations of life, right? I transcend, basically God is saying, I transcend the even notion of life itself. I mean, yeah, he's God, right? So, but for the sake of human language and limitation, God is basically saying, wherever there is anything that lives, I am there. That is what he is saying, right? Because nothing has life without me. This is where the philosopher Karl Barth came up with his statement, all things exist in God, right? All things exist in God. And he uses this passage to understand that. Well, he used the Matthew one as well. This is actually, when I came up with, what I'm saying is that I didn't come up with this, okay? Right? And Karl Barth obviously didn't come up with this. Like, the Bible had been teaching this for years. It was only a matter of time before somebody saw that, right? So anyway, it's been hidden right in front. It's been sitting in plain sight, basically. And so God is saying, wherever there is life, wherever there is existence, you know, I exist there because I made that, right? And nothing and this is where, once again, you have to see that, like, this angel of the Lord is clearly the Jesus figure, right? Because, you know, Colossians, the book of Colossians pokes at this too, right? You know, all things, and John 1 also pokes at this, you know, all things were made through him and nothing was made without him, right? When they talk about Jesus. And in the same way, in Exodus, once again, you know, you can assume that the New Testament writers knew this, right? Once again, you know, it's all there, right? It's just a matter of you seeing it, right? It's a matter of, you know, understanding the scriptures, right? And this is why Jesus, you know, criticizes the Sadducees, right? Do you not know the scriptures, right? And the Sadducees are supposed to be like experts, right? So, anyway, in this scene, God is saying, like, hey, you know, like, all things, nothing exists without me. Like, that's who I am, right? Nothing exists without me. So you cannot begin to comprehend that, right? And I mean, how can we, right? With our finite human brains, understand that nothing in the universe can exist without God, right? I mean, it's easy to say that out loud, but, like, to really comprehend that in here, I don't know if that's possible, right? And I mean, of course, it's not meant to be possible, but that's kind of what's going on here in this scene. So the burning bush scene is, this is why it's so famous, right? I mean, even if you don't know the Bible very well, even if you're not a Christian, this is a scene you should know, because everybody uses this scene, right? This kind of revelation that God uses. You find this all the time in, like, other forms of literature, because this is such a profound scene, and when other literature want to have something just, you know, try to be as profound, they use this scene, right? This reference of, like, I am beyond, right? I am existence, right? All things that exist because of me, right? And that's kind of what God is revealing in this scene, and by extension, you know, the person of Christ is kind of displayed here, at least according to the New Testament writers, who talk about how, like, well, Jesus possesses all these same qualities that God reveals in this scene, right? That he exists, all things exist through him, and nothing was made without him. And that is kind of why the I am statement is so fascinating, right? And then, of course, God decides to play by human terms, because he's like that, right? Because, I mean, to be fair, humans can never play on God's terms. That's kind of, like, absurd to think, right? But so God descends and plays by human rules, and so he does allow himself to just be referred to as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, which is basically saying he is the God of the living. Which would be very weird to think, because, once again, you know, Abraham, at this point in time in Exodus, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are long since dead. They're historical figures, right? It's been hundreds of years since, you know, Jacob, right? So to say that when God says that I am the God of these people, right? He is not. It sounds like he's saying he's just some kind of ancestral tribal God, but then when Jesus clarifies that he's God of the living and uses the names of three people that, you know, by all natural means are dead, right? There's something else going on here, and it's this idea that it is beyond what we can comprehend. So there's really, like, we can exhaust this topic. I don't know if we can. I can talk the whole stream about this, but I'm not going to, because I plan to finish reading Exodus at some point, right? So, and do another book. So, with that being said, you know, if you guys want, we could do, like, another, like, Q&A video on this part alone, because that's how much is in chapter 3 and this burning bush scene, right? It's why it's like every other everybody in Judaism and Christianity acknowledges that, like, the Exodus story is one of the most important stories. Of course, in Christianity, it's the person of Jesus ultimately, because the resurrection makes the entire Bible matter. So that's the Christian worldview. Whereas, like, in Exodus, right? Or sorry, in Judaism, you know, this is the central identity of who the Jews worship, right? And so it kind of is like this weird thought pattern, right? Where, like, Christianity, that would also be true, but Christians claim that it's true because Christ verifies all of that in his resurrection. It's kind of like the simple way I try to word it is that, like, in Christianity, the idea is that the resurrection is the most important doctrine, right? Because when Jesus makes the claims that he is the same being here in the burning bush, right? Either Jesus is right or he's wrong. When you make and I mean, that's a big statement to make. And so in Christianity, the idea is that, okay, how can Jesus possibly verify this? And it's the resurrection. So the way that I say it is, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then none of the Bible matters. If Jesus did rise from the dead, then everything matters, right? And so it's kind of one of those things. And because of the latter, you know, in the Christian worldview, that's the latter is true, then of course we have to go back to Exodus and analyze this scene and how profound it is, right? So that's kind of the weird, I know it's kind of like a weird circular logic, but you just got to go with it. That's kind of how it is. But anyway, that's enough of chapter 3. If you request, like, oh yeah, let's do like a video, just us keep talking about this, because like I said, I can spend a whole stream talking about this scene alone. It's so profound. But, like, I'm not going to, because, you know, I'm gonna finish this at some point. And we're already like an hour and 15 minutes in, and only 3 chapters in Exodus. Exodus ain't a short book, so I mean, it's not as long as Genesis, but it's still pretty long. So we want to get a move on, because I don't want to spend like 15 weeks reading Exodus like I did with Genesis. So let's get a move on. Alrighty. I'm going to drink after that. Chapter 4. So Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me, or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" And the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," Moses replied. The Lord said, throw it onto the ground." So Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and Moses ran from it. And the Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. "This," said the Lord, "is that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Then the Lord said, "Put your hand inside your cloak." So Moses put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, the skin was leprous. It had become white as snow. "Now put it back in your cloak," he said. So Moses put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored, like the rest of his flesh. And the Lord said, "If they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these 2 signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground." So Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." The Lord said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what you have to say." But Moses said, "Pardon your servant, Lord, but please send someone else." Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, "What about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. But take this staff in your hand so that you may perform the signs with it." Then Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Let me return to my own people in Egypt to see if any of them are still alive." And Jethro said, "Go, I wish you well." Now the Lord had said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead." So Moses took his wife and his sons, and put them on a donkey and started back to Egypt. And he took the staff of God in his hand. The Lord said to Moses, "When you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then say to Pharaoh, 'This is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go so that he may worship me. But you refused to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn.'" At a lodging place along the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, youch, and touched Moses' feet with it. Gross. "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me," she said. So the Lord let him alone. And at that time she said bridegroom of blood referred to circumcision. Because yeah, we're talking about that again. The Lord said to Aaron, "Go into the wilderness to meet Moses." So he met Moses at the mountain and kissed him. Then Moses told Aaron everything the Lord had sent him to say, and also about all the signs he was commanded to perform. Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders of Israel, and Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they all believed. And when they heard that God was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped. Alright, so chapter 4. Also quite a lot in here, so let's talk about it. Alright, so first part, let's talk about the rest of the encounter with the burning bush. That's what we'll refer to it on from now on. So, first Moses is just like, yo, like, what am I supposed to do when I get to Egypt? Like, you want me to go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let the people go? Well, what do you expect me to do after that? And God's like, yo, like, I will give you the power to, do these wonders. And we'll find out what those are later. But, I'll give you this, like, godlike power, basically, is what God is telling him, right? You'll be more than any man when you meet the Pharaoh, right? You'll be able to do my wonders, and you will be perceived as more than a man. And Pharaoh will fall to his knees, basically. And then Moses is just like, well, I'm not totally sure about that. Can you like what do you mean by wonders? Good question, right? So God's first like, okay, throw your stick on the ground and it turns to a snake. You know, it's pretty impressive. And then of course, there's the part where he's like, okay, put your hand in your cloak. And then his hand came out leprous. Now, of course, you know, there's the famous disease of leprosy. Thank God in the 21st century, hell, for like over a couple of centuries now, we have, well, not a couple, well, yeah, a couple of centuries now, we have a cure for leprosy. So that's a thing you don't hear of much anymore. But basically what leprosy is a kind of like skin disease that basically like would eat away at your muscle and flesh tissue. And so it was not a pretty sight, and it was pretty awful if you had leprosy, right? Because once again, you have like basically a flesh-eating disease. And in the ancient world, there was no real way around this, right? I mean, you can try your best to like bathe as often as you can and avoid, you know, having leprosy. But even that, it's not like a 100% preventative. Thank God that, you know, thanks to the modern miracles of medicine, right? And thank God for it, we have a cure for leprosy. So that's why you never hear about leprosy anymore, right? It's not a disease that exists today. Not really, right? Because if anybody got leprosy, you could easily, like, you know, a simple, you know, antidote for it exists. You know, a single shot, done, right? And you're cured of leprosy, right? And because of high cleanliness in our modern society as well, for the most part, it's also extremely difficult to get leprosy. So basically that's why leprosy is never a thing in the 21st century, right? Because not only is it extremely easy to prevent, because running water is a thing, and so with running water, it's way easier to clean yourself and prevent it. And even if you did get it, we have easy antidotes, and leprosy can easily be cured, and so we don't have to worry about it anymore. But in the ancient world, this was a big problem because, one, hygiene are not the top of people's priority list. Secondly, it was hard to like constantly bathe. Bathing was not something, like, think about it like this, like, since running water didn't exist and filtration systems and stuff like that did not exist, right? Even if you bathed often, the water you bathed in was not always safe, right? So you're not safe from leprosy, even if you bathed a lot in the ancient world. And of course, like, you know, in the Middle East where the air is more arid, it's easier to, you know, it's harder to keep like clean, and especially like if you sweat when you travel a lot, right? We don't have like, you know, easy access to like clean face towels and stuff like that to wipe your sweat or anything. Like all the things that we have now to easily prevent, you know, leprosy, those things didn't exist back then, okay? And let alone you didn't have a cure, right? I mean, the resolution that the Bible had was like, okay, you stay away from everybody, you isolate, and you hope that the flesh-eating disease stops eating you, right? Like, which is not very helpful, right? And so it sucked in the ancient world to get leprosy. But don't worry, because I read the scary word to you in today's stream, don't think like, oh no, I'm going to get leprosy if I don't shower every day. Like, relax. In 2021, the fear is COVID, not leprosy. So you don't have to worry about leprosy, of all things. COVID is still a thing, leprosy is not. Anyway, so there's the whole thing with like the leprosy hand thing, that God like makes Moses have leprosy and then he makes it disappear, because God can do that. He can manipulate molecules, I guess, because he's God. So anyway, then Moses. One of the funny things about Moses in this scene is that, like, once again, this is supposedly like the greatest Israelite that ever lived, and he's like, before he's like an enemy of his own people, He murders a guy, and now he's like the biggest coward, because he's like, he encountered. Okay, so you gotta think of it like this way, right? Like, let's imagine the scene again. So he's standing in front of a burning bush. That the bush does not die, right? Because I mean that's part of the whole miracle, right? The bush does not die from the fire, right? And now there's a magical voice speaking to him, right? And now this voice is saying like, I am a being beyond comprehension. So you can imagine my power is beyond comprehension. That's sound logic. Okay. And yet Moses is still afraid. Like, if a magical being told you, hey, I'm going to make you basically a god compared to every other mortal being, you can do what I tell you to do, right? If I give you all this power, right? It should be easy, right? But no, Moses is like complaining, and he's all scared, right? And he's like, well, I'm not totally sure. What do you mean by these wonders? So he's doubting God, right? And God's like, look, I just did 2 miracles for you, guy. Like, you can do this thing, right? Like, just go and do what I told you to do. And then Moses complains even further, and he's all like, oh, I'm not very good at speech. I'll just tell you what to say. Like, it'll be like right now, the magical voice in your head, and I will tell you what to say, and then you just say it. It can't be that hard, right? And so Moses keeps complaining, and, he's being a total coward here, which is not how you want to paint, your great hero, right? Moses was one of the great heroes of Israel's history, and here he is, painted as like a total coward right now. And so Moses, like, he goes on cowering in fear, right? And he's just like, look, I can't do this. I can't say anything to people. I'm so bad at speaking. And God's like, no, get your brother to do it. Like, if you're so scared I'll send you with someone else. You're not by yourself now. I mean, you never were, because I'm here. But, like, it's kind of funny where, like, God is... And then the Bible even points out that God gets fed up with Moses, basically, right? In verse 14. The Lord's anger burned against Moses. And so, like, God gets pretty mad at him. He's just like, what the heck, man? Like, I've already given you more than enough. I've made you basically a god compared to every other living being. And you're still afraid to do what I tell you. Like, this is ridiculous. Is basically what God is, like, saying to him, right? He's like, this is ridiculous, right? Which leads up to a later scene that we'll point out in a second. But it's kind of funny where, like, it's one of those things where a lot of Christians will talk about how, like, well, this is how we know the Bible's trustworthy. And, I agree with this sentiment, right? Where, why would the Bible paint its heroes, someone like Moses, to be, like, a total coward? And not just a coward, but he's pretty pathetic, right? Like, he's not just scared to do something. He's, like, it's not even, like, it's, like, unjustifiable fear, right? Now, you can think of something like Lord of the Rings, right? Okay, like, it's scary to fight what's the big spider's name? When Sam has to fight the big spider to save Frodo. I can't remember her name. But, like, okay, it's different when, like, J.R.R. Tolkien describes how afraid Sam is in that scene. But that's different, right? Sam is a little hobbit against a giant man-eating spider. Totally different, right? Here, in the Bible, Moses is afraid despite the opposite, right? Because in this scene, God is basically saying, I'm going to make you like me, right? And God even says that, to your brother, you will be like as if you were God to him. Of course, he says it after, God's anger is kindled against Moses. Like, that, and that's the reason why God says that, right? That I will make you like God to Aaron, right? Because God is expressing how mad he is. He's like, how can you not be satisfied with what I've given you, right? And then he like, in the earlier parts of the passage, God implies it, right? He implies that, like, well, Moses, you're going to have all this power, right? You have my authority. You have and with that, like, with my power and my authority, like, who can stand up to you, right? Is basically what God is implying, right? I've given you my power, my authority. So the implication is, well, then, who can possibly challenge you, right? and yet Moses is still afraid. So the opposite. This is kind of the opposite when I use like the Lord of the Rings illustration earlier, right? It's one thing for Sam to be afraid of a giant spider, right? Sam is a little hobbit with what? A sword and the light thingy, right? But aside from like the sword and the light thingy, he really isn't that intimidating to a giant man-eating spider, right? But in Moses' case here, it's the complete opposite, right? Moses is the one who would be in control of the situation if he has God's power on his side, right? But no, Moses is still afraid, right? He's so afraid. And this is, it's one of those funny things where it's like, why would the Bible paint Moses this way? And it seems ridiculous when you think about it that way, right? Like, well, why is Moses so scared? Why should he be afraid at all? He has God on his side. Who can possibly challenge him, right? But yet, here he is, right? Moses cowering in fear, right? Now, of course, some people may try and make the argument that, like, well, he's still in the presence of God, and so he's afraid every second of this encounter, and that could be said, and that is true to an extent as well. But, it should be a different kind of fear. Like, he shouldn't, if he knows what real, like, you can think of it this way, to counteract that argument. If Moses knows what real fear is, being in the presence of God and all, right, then what is Pharaoh, right? What is any human being, right? Like, if Moses has seen real fear, encountering God and not dying, right, then, who is anyone else, right? Well, who is Pharaoh once you've encountered real fear, right? But no, Moses is scared to confront Pharaoh. And so, this is not how you paint a protagonist, right? And this is where many Christians, many people who, a lot of people would say, well, the Bible's made up, and then other people would try to rebuttal that by saying, well, there's a lot of things the Bible does that would not suggest that it's fake, right? Because you wouldn't paint your heroes as, like, cowards and failures, right? And I talked about this with Abraham, right? Abraham was a failure. Isaac, bit of a failure. Not as much, though. He not as bad as Abraham. Jacob, definitely a failure, right? I mean, he had to steal his brother's birthright to get blessing. Like, that's a real failure right there. And so, like, and now we have Moses here, right? In exile, and a scared little, a scared little pussycat at this case, in this case, right? With Moses. Not how you paint, a man of God, right? You would think that as a man of God, he'd be like, all right, I'm ready to take on the world any day of the week, right? But, the running theme of the Bible is, once again, it's not about what people can do, right? Because clearly, Moses ain't up to the task. So, this story ain't gonna be about what Moses can do. Because from what we can see, Moses he's scared little chicken crap, right? It's not about what Moses can do, even though God has apparently gave him his power, right? It's not about what Moses can do. It's about what God can do, right? And so, God is going to provide a way for Moses to still do this task that God basically has it in the bag because, he's God and all that. So, now, sorry, I was just fixing something there. We're going to see how that, plays out, right? About, how God will act. Because obviously, Moses ain't going to do it very well on his own. And so God even provides him Aaron, his brother, to help out, right? Because, God alone should have been sufficient, right? For Moses to do this task. So the next scene, Moses leaves home in Midian. And then, we're going to talk about this part first, because I'm going to skip this middle part of the chapter first. I'm going to talk about the last part of the chapter. Because I want to go back to this thing where, like, the Bible even points out that God gets super pissed at Moses you know, his anger is kindled against him, as it reads in verse 14. His anger burns against Moses. And so there's this funny scene in the Bible, and I remember when I read this, I was like, what the heck? And there's this scene here. It goes from verse 24 to basically 26. It's only like 3 verses long, right? But it's this really awkward scene. And it makes you really wonder what's going on, you know, with God and Moses. And, you know, the Bible as a whole, and what does it say about us and how we interact with God. There's a scene where, like, okay, so Moses is heading back to Egypt, right? And so they're at some kind of inn or something, some lodging place, right? And I guess God is chilling out there because it says that Moses meets God there. So God's chilling out there. And what does God do? God nearly kills the guy. Now, the Bible's not explicit on how this would have gone about, whether, like, God straight up pulled a sword on him or something, or, like, you know, like, God, like, was charging up an energy blast, just, like, fire at him and blow him to the next dimension or something, right? Like, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly. But, like, basically, Moses almost dies in this encounter. And Moses' wife gets so scared, she, like, circumcises her 2 sons. And then, like, throws the foreskin, which is really gross, but she throws it at Moses' feet. And is like, no, this will be enough blood, okay? No blood is going to be shed here, is basically what she's saying. Right? No blood will be shed here. And this is the blood price to make sure, you know, my son's foreskins. But it's kind of funny where, like, you know, you look back and it's like, wait, so God just told Moses, hey, yeah, I want you to go to Egypt and do this stuff for me, right? And then later there's this scene where God's straight up like, you ready to die? And so, I don't know, I always found this scene kind of funny. Now that I read it, you know, every time I read it and I think about it. Because I guess only someone as nerdy as me actually sits down and thinks about this scene. But it's a very interesting scene, right? Where, and you have to look at it in the context of chapter 3 and earlier in chapter 4, right? So, Moses was in the presence of God earlier. And, you know, there's this whole thing in, like, Jewish worldview that, like, of course, you know, you cannot look upon the face of God, right? Because if you do, you're going to die, right? Because God is holy, we are not. If we encounter the holy in purest form, you're going to die. That's just what they thought, and for good reason. And so, you know, here's Moses, he encounters God in the burning bush and doesn't die. Now here, there's this scene here, and God's like, you know, maybe God's still angry about earlier, who knows? But, like, he was ready to end Moses there. Because it's one of those things like, why? Why did this happen? Like, there was the whole burning bush and Moses didn't die, so why here? Right? But then this leads to something I thought about. And, you know, you gotta read, you know, going back with Genesis as well. That this is the reason why the Israelites feared encountering God. And you see this as a common thing throughout the Bible. Is that, like, there's a reason why there's a fear of ever encountering God. And that is because, you know, if God is holy and sinless, and he cannot be around sin, right? Then if he were to be in the presence of sin, wouldn't God's reflex be to kill it? And that is why the Israelites are afraid to encounter God, right? Because, you know, as human beings, we have sin in our lives. So if God encountered us, you know, the first thing he'd want to do is kill it, right? He want to kill all of us because of the sin in our lives. That would be his reflex. That would be a reflex to God. And maybe that's why the first time he approaches Moses is in a form of a burning bush. Because a bush cannot move. I mean, I suppose God could, like, do, like, a poison ivy thing and make, like, the branches move and, like, extend them to, like, killer branches or something. I mean, anything is possible. But, like, you know, in the form of a bush, you know, God stays stationary. So maybe he doesn't let out his rage, right? But I think there's also, like, you know, the whole Jesus metaphor here too, and why it's a burning bush. And the burning bush, you know, the pain is on himself, right? He puts upon himself, because if, you know, if you light up a bush on fire, the bush is gonna die, right? So at least it should, right? Except in this scene it doesn't, because God is preserving the bush at the same time. Or maybe there's like some kind of phoenix metaphor here, where like the bush may be burned up, but it constantly revives itself because of God's resurrection power. I don't. Once again, this is thinking about, you know, what's going on in chapter 3 and chapter 4. And this scene in chapter 4 is so bizarre, right? Because, you know, if God is in the presence of a sinful human being like Moses, and we already established he's not a great guy, right? He doubts God, which is, I guess, in its own right a sin. He kills a guy, definitely a sin, right? Let's see. I mean, there are probably other things on the list. We just don't know. But, I mean, the murder thing alone is, you know, you've broken all the commandments, right? So, you know, if God is in the presence of Moses, he's gonna, the reflex would be for God to kill him. But I think an interesting thing to think about the burning bush scene is that God inflicts that pain onto himself, and that's why he's a bush on fire, right? And so he is taking the pain on himself, which is weird to think about. That why would God choose the form of a bush of all things, and then put him and light himself on fire, right? It's almost like a Michael Jackson in the Pepsi commercial. But basically, I think what's going on here is that, you know, God inflicted the pain on himself, and that's why he doesn't kill Moses in the burning bush scene, because God easily could have, and it makes sense that killing Moses would have been his reflex action, right? Of course, many people would try and downplay the scene, like, well, of course he's not going to kill Moses. He's calling Moses, you know, to deliver Israel. Well, that didn't seem to stop him here, right? Like, you know, God was ready to just, like, hey, you ready to meet your maker, right? Like, he was, like, God was ready to do that in verse 24. So what gives, right? And I think it's when, you know, I think that's the importance of the gospel, and why it's so important to remember that Jesus died for our sins, right? Because if he didn't, then once again, God should just be outright killing all of us, because he can't be in any of our presence because of the sin in our lives, right? He ought to outright kill every last one of us. And so the burning bush scene does kind of show what Christ will do later, right? And once again, this is why, and I agree, where a lot of, you know, Christian scholars, Christian Bible scholars, because Jewish ones may think differently, but they think that, like, okay, the angel of the Lord in the burning bush is still Christ, right? And it's interesting that, like, Christ is already, it's one of those things that, like, you know, Christ is already, like, putting himself, if you will, through the sacrifice process, right? Because once again, the burning bush, another thing to think about a burning bush, right? In order to have a fire keep going in any sacrifice, you need wood to do it, right? You need your firewood, obviously. And so, you know, God provides that, right? He also provides and then of course later on he provides the sacrificial lamb part too. But he is the wood and he is the lamb in the sacrifice. And he's also the fire, right? He's all those things, right? Which is, you know, significance of the sacrifice system later on, right? And how it represents who Jesus is. And this is important to think about, because this is why the sacrifice model for the Jews later, which we'll cross this bridge again, and I'll obviously explain this again when we get there. But this is why the sacrifice system is built the way it is. And the interesting thing to think of, and I mentioned this in Genesis, where God will give, before he gives a commandment, he usually plays out basically he does it himself, right? And, you know, this is also true in the New Testament. You know, Jesus gives, you know, the Beatitudes, and he gives, like, the Sermon on the Mount. And of course, he goes and does it himself, right? Because, to quote Optimus Prime, a great leader will never as a great leader, I will never give you an order that I will not do myself, right? And so in the same way, this is exactly what Jesus does, right? He never gives us a command without doing it himself. And so I think the burning bush is also very interesting because he is doing the sacrifice himself already in this scene, right? You know, it's not like just the historical person of Jesus that does the sacrifice in first century, but rather God establishes the sacrifice. And even before, right? You can say that, you know, once again, in Genesis 3, God performs the first sacrifice, which is how he got the clothes for Adam and Eve. Here, he is now displaying the model of the sacrifice by being a burning bush. And that's my answer to why he picks that form. Whether it's the true answer or not, well, we'll just have to ask God when we get there. But that's my answer to the question of why God picks the form of burning bush. But with that being said, and all the sacrifice stuff, and you know, he is sacrificing for sin, for Moses' sin in that moment, if you will. Here, that's not the case in verse 24 of chapter 4, right? God is not the burning bush form. He is maybe a humanoid form or something. The Bible's not clear on it, right? Let's say for simplicity, he's a humanoid form, right? And not performing the sacrifice, right? So when he's not performing the sacrifice, he's ready for, like, you gonna die? You ready to die? Right? God's in that mode now, right? When he's in the presence of sin. And so that may be why he acts the way he does, which is, once again, you know, when you read it at face value, it's kind of like, oh, that's weird. Didn't God just call Moses to go to Egypt, and now on the way there, God is ready to, like, end his life? But I think that might be the reason why this scene happens. But the reason why I focus on this scene is because it's also very important to think about, you know, our own relationship dynamic with God, and all the more reason, you know, we need Jesus in our lives and to accept his sacrifice, just like with the burning bush, with Moses and the burning bush, right? We need to, this is why we ought to accept Christ's gift, right? Because what would happen, right? It would be a scene like this, right? If you were to encounter God without the blood of the Lamb covering you, without God's sacrifice for you, right? If you encounter God without that, you know, he gonna come charging saying you ready to die, right? And that is not a place you want to be, right? So I know I kind of laugh about it, but I mean, it is a terrifying thought, but I think it is something really important to think about. And I think this is why the scene is actually kind of interesting and why the Bible includes it, right? Because you're supposed to see that contrast between accepting the sacrifice of God and not accepting the sacrifice. And ironically, Moses gets both, right? He gets to see both sides to an extent, right? He doesn't have the blood to cover him because Jesus didn't die for sins yet. And then, of course, you know, he doesn't actually die in this scene either in verse 24. And so this Moses is like teeter-tottering on the two dynamics, right? And I think it's interesting to really look at Moses this way. And I think this scene really paints a lot of the rest of Exodus. Oddly enough, which kind of baffles my mind. Why, well, I mean, obviously in Sunday schools you don't tell this story. But like, why more pastors don't actually talk about this little passage, which actually says a lot when you understand the grand context, right? Because this is still the reality. This is the reality of not accepting Christ's sacrifice, right? Is this terrifying moment that even if you think God has called you, if the blood of the Lamb, if Christ's death is not, you know, if you've not accepted the, you know, Christ's death and the forgiveness in that, you know, this could well be your fate, right? You will encounter God and it will be your end, right? And so the quick thinking of his wife, Moses' wife, is to give someone else's blood, a little bit of it, in the foreskin of her sons, right? And to say, this is the blood price. Don't kill Moses. I mean, to be fair, I mean, is your husband. You don't want God killing him for good reason, right? So I think that's actually this is an important scene to study. And I find this scene so fascinating, especially when, like, you know, with everything else in context. It is really interesting to see, like, this is the dynamic between man and God. And this is all the more reason we need Christ in our lives and why we need to accept his sacrifice for us. Because if you don't have his sacrifice to cover your sin, to cover and cleanse your sins, then, you know, it ain't looking good. And you could be in a lot of danger if you encountered God, right? So, finally we have the last part of the chapter. I'll just cover this quickly, where basically Moses encounters Aaron and they meet, they have a reunion. And then they decide to start moving to Egypt. And then when they get there, you know, they get the elders just as God told Moses to do, and so far everything's moving smoothly, right? Just like God said it would. But of course, God did say other things were going to happen, and that's what we're going to read about next. And I'm going to read chapter 5, and I'm probably going to end it there, because I know I rambled quite a bit for chapter 3 and 4, but once again, honestly, I can make an entire stream on chapter 3, and maybe an entire stream on chapter 4, but I'm not going to. So we're just going to read chapter 5. Well, that's because it'll be a good place to stop as well, because chapter 6, if I read from chapter 6 to like chapter 10, or maybe even, well, I'm just thinking about next week, okay? Next week I would read like 7 chapters. I would read 6 chapters. I would read from chapter 6 to chapter 11, which would be like, well, that's 6 chapters, right? So next week is a pretty long haul. So, but those chapters don't have as much explaining like I did with like the chapter 3 and chapter 4 of Exodus. So you don't have to worry about that too much. But I'm going to read chapter 5 because it will be a good place to stop. And then chapter 6 to chapter 11 is another huge famous scene in the Bible. And so I think that deserves its own stream. So, I mean, clearly it does. And we want to fit all of those chapters together, right, in one stream. So, here we go. Chapter 5. This will be the last chapter we read today. I gotta flip back because for some reason I was on chapter 10 there. Alright. Chapter 5. So afterwards, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh, and they said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival for me in the wilderness." And Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, so he may strike us." Or he may strike. Okay, I gotta read that again, because I totally misread that. "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us make a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword." But the king of Egypt said, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work." Then Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you are stopping them from working?" That same day, Pharaoh gave his order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people. "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw. But require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy, and that is why they are crying out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.' Make the work harder for the people, so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies." Then the slave drivers and the overseers went out and said to the people, This is what the Pharaoh says. I will not give you any more straw. Go and get your own straw wherever you can find it." but your work will not be reduced at all. So the people scattered all over Egypt to gather stubble to use for straw. The slave drivers kept pressing them, saying, "Complete the work required of you for each day, just as when you had straw." And Pharaoh's slave drivers beat the Israelites, demanding, "Why haven't you met your quota of bricks yesterday or today like before?" Then the Israelite overseers went and appealed to Pharaoh. "Why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, yet we are told make brick. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people." And Pharaoh said, "Lazy, lazy, that's what you are, lazy. That's why you keep saying, 'Let us go and sacrifice to the Lord.' Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet you must produce your full quota of brick." The Israelite overseers realized they were in trouble when they were told, "You are not to reduce the number of bricks required of you each day." When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them. And they said, May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." So Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Why, Lord? Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." So we're going to end it there on a cliffhanger, because when Moses approached Pharaoh, the situation only got worse. And so, not much to really say about this chapter. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? I'm just looking at something. I might actually read chapter 6, because I realized chapter 5 was really short, and also, I don't have a lot to say about it. Basically, Pharaoh just... This Pharaoh, who's a different one from the last one, in Exodus 1. This Pharaoh, I mean, it's easy to see why people would think they're the same guy, even though the Bible tells you they're not. But you can kind of see why people would think that they're the same guy, because this Pharaoh here, he's equally as much of a meanie, right? And I could think of other negative words, but I won't say them, right? But he's equally, if not worse, right? He's pretty awful, right? This Pharaoh's basically just as bad as the other guy. He's not a good guy. And so, I mean, what's the Israelites going to do, right? But once again, it's not about what Israel's going to do. God is ready to move. He's ready to act. And so, I think I will end it on chapter 5. Because chapter 6, God responds to Moses and will say, like, I'm going in, right? You watch me work. You just be faithful, is what God basically tells Moses in chapter 6. But in chapter 5, you know, the scene is painted, right? It just looks so hopeless for Israel. You know, Moses tries to have Pharaoh let the people go, and Pharaoh only makes things worse. He's like, I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. Who do you think you are? I'm going to make things worse for the Israelites just because you said that, right? And so he decides to make the people suffer and make them try and work way more than they already do, and then punishes them for not doing it, right? I know somebody's ready to say, like, oh, that sounds like modern day capitalism, which, well, you're not wrong in a lot of ways, but once again, you know, the scene is painted pretty bad for Israel, but this is where God will act on behalf of Israel. And of course, you know, from a narrative perspective, once again, it's using the popular trope of, like, just before the moment of hope comes, right? You know, in this case, you know, God saving his people. There's an old saying, right? It's always darkest before dawn. And that's definitely true here. And so, God is going to show up to rescue his people. But I'm going to save that for next stream. So I'm actually not going to read anymore. I thought maybe I could squeeze in chapter 6. But chapter 6 is where God responds to Moses and then kind of starts the whole like saving Israel thing, right? So I don't have much else to say about chapter 5 because chapter 5 is pretty straightforward. I mean, all the function of chapter 5 is just to put that darkest before dawn moment, right? And then now God is going to act. But I'm going to save that for next stream. And that will be next Friday. So if you have any questions about anything I just read, go ahead, shoot them in the comments, and then I'll try and address them. I'll do my best to address them, rather. And then I'm just going to do some housekeeping now, and if there's no questions, we'll end the stream. So, next week, we're going to try and go for 5 streams again. We'll see if we can, because Wednesday might be a little bit tough. Because I gotta go, not for me, but I have to go to the doctor. I gotta take someone to the doctor, rather. So, Wednesday we'll see if I'm back in time, right, to stream. Because that will be like in the morning, like lunchtime basically, the appointment's at like 12 or something like that. So, depends how long that takes, right? It just shouldn't take long. I'm just saying if there are any complications, then I won't stream because then there'll be complications. And if you get a complication from the hospital, well, that will definitely dampen the mood too. So I'm just going to let you guys know that is a possibility for Wednesday. But Monday we'll finish Gawain and the Green Knight. I'll try and be more awake for that stream because, it depends on how work goes that day as well and how much sleep I get the night before and, a bunch of other factors. So we'll see how energized I am for Monday's stream, but I do want to finish Gawain and the Green Knight. It is a good poem to read. And then Tuesday will be Fire Emblem Three Houses. We'll be continuing that. I gotta go squash Lenato's Rebellion and the start of next Tuesday's stream, so make sure you tune in at 3 o'clock Pacific time for that. And then Thursday, we'll do a Throwback Thursday. We'll see what I end up doing for it. I have an idea, but it'll be like kind of more one-off things as opposed to like starting a big project for Throwback Thursday. But we're going to try and keep Throwback Thursdays like pretty regular, right? And of course next Friday we'll be continuing the Exodus story and of course how God will deliver the Israelites. At least most of it, because I mean Exodus has got a lot of chapters dedicated to God saving the Israelites, but that will be for next week's stream. So I hope you guys, tune in for that. If you want notifications of when I stream, you can always subscribe to the channel. You can also follow me on Discord. I have my personal account is in the description, and you can request to be joined into the channel. And from there, I post news when I stream. And of course, you can always just rewind a little bit of this video. I'll just give you a quick overview of next week. So Monday, Gawain Green Knight. Tuesday and maybe Wednesday will be Fire Emblem Three Houses. Thursday is Throwback Thursday, and Friday will be Exodus from chapter 6 to maybe chapter 11. That's kind of the idea. I stream each of those days. I'll start about 3 o'clock Pacific time. And I hope you guys, will tune into those. Also, keep your eyes peeled as I am somewhat approaching the later part of my Shadow Dragon Let's Play. So I hope you guys check that out as well. Anyway, for the list of it, there are no questions. This is going to be the end of the stream. I hope you guys enjoyed, going through the book of Exodus. And I hope that you guys will learn a lot about, the identity of Israel and all that with, the book of Exodus. And I hope that reading through Exodus will be enlightening for you. This is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your night. Hope you guys have a good weekend. And I will see you guys next week. God bless you. And have a great day.